Good morning, folks. Chris here. Hope you guys are having a nice morning. The topic of the video today, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. The big mammoth of a book. The gargantuan Goliath. Humongous. Excessive. Epic. That is War and Peace. I refrain from calling it a book sometimes. It's a bit of it's a tome. It's a national epic, you would say, for the Russians. And sometimes the reason I refrain from calling it a book is because the way the book is itself partitioned can be confusing. So, War and Peace is composed of 4 parts, and within each of these parts there are 4 volumes or 4 books. It is fairly standard in 19th century to have different books. They wouldn't just publish the whole book as it is. They like War and Peace would have been in, I think, like 16 different books, basically. But yeah, there's 4 parts to War and Peace, and within each of those 4 parts there are 4 volumes or 4 books. So all in total there are approximately 16 volumes or 16 books. It's I don't think it's quite that number maybe, but it's around that number. I would say 16 books or volumes. And within each of these books or volumes, I'll just call them volumes because I think that's what my edition calls it. There are 20 chapters around. And the chapters aren't too long. They're not these lengthy, beefy, long chapters. None of them are really that long. But there are 20 chapters. And 20 chapters in 16 volumes, that's plus a 2-part epilogue, a 2-volume epilogue, I should say. And the epilogue itself, each of them functions as a volume. So then you got an extra 40 chapters. It comes to around 360 chapters, War and Peace. So this is a big, beefy book. About 1,200 pages. Some editions a bit more, some editions less, depending on the typeface. I read the first 100 pages in, I believe it was a mod translation. It wasn't a revised mod, but it was an old mod translation. This was for Wordsworth Classics. It was the edition which had Napoleon on the cover. It's that famous picture, Napoleon crossing the Alps, where he's on the stallion, and it's this sort of heavily propagandized picture where he's on this, I think, brown stallion, and he's looking all gallant, when in reality he crossed it on a pack mule. So Napoleon he was really excellent at propaganda. Yeah, and that was, I believe it was the mod translation, and I read it for the first 100 pages, but because I read it it was a physical book, and big book, cumbersome book, I had to move around a lot in my life. I had to move around a lot, and I didn't want to be lugging this tome around, so I ended up getting a Kindle version. And I got the Pivar and Volkonsky translation. And part of the reason I got that translation is it is the most recent. It is the most current translation. I believe it is. Am I wrong? Or is there another? There might be another translation that's more recent because there are many of these translations going around. I think there's a revised mod translation that's also quite new. But the Pivar and Volkonsky is a very new translation. I think it was in 2007. And that couple, Pivar and Volkonsky, they're quite known for their Russian translations. I believe I read a translation of The Idiot by them, And yeah, I didn't like The Idiot. Let's just say that. I maybe I'll have to give that book another attempt, but I wasn't the biggest fan. But another reason why I picked this translation, it wasn't as much that it's the newest translation, but it was that this edition, this translation, keeps the French in War and Peace intact. So War and Peace, the gigantic book, but Tolstoy didn't write it all in one language. He wrote, there's about, I would say, 4%? 4%? Yeah. Yeah, 3 or 4% of the book is in French. Now, for a book with 360 chapters, 1,200 pages, 3%, 4% is a pretty significant amount of French. There are pages and pages of French. There are, consistently, there are just phrases in French that people will say in French. Many letters are exchanged in just French. In fact, I would say most of the letters that are exchanged are in French. Perhaps, I don't want to go as far as to say all the letters that are exchanged are in French. But French is really the language of the aristocracy. They're using that language. It's the elite. They know that language. And obviously, what is War and Peace about? So this is, I've gone through a big preamble regarding translations and how big War and Peace is, but what is it even about? War and Peace is, it's about the Napoleonic Wars, in effect, and how it affected Russia, how it changed the lives of many people, many real people, many fictional people. Now, that is what War and Peace is about in its crudest form, the Napoleonic Wars and how it affected Russia. War and Peace was actually set up as a... Tolstoy had planned to make at least 2 or 3 books. He had planned to make War and Peace as a sort of preamble to another book called The Decembrists. So the Decembrists was a revolt that took place in, I think, the 1820s in Russia, and I'm not too familiar with it. But a lot of people got exiled to Siberia, and War and Peace is sort of the build-up to those events. Let me get my coffee there. He never ended up writing The Decembrists, but you can see in the epilogue, especially part 1 of the epilogue, that something is building up, that there might be more to this story, even in the epilogue. And the epilogue itself is a lengthy, sometimes arduous, especially the second volume of the epilogue is very arduous. But you see that something is building up in the first volume. All right, excuse me. Now, War and Peace, it's about the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, that's a very crude way to say it. But before we say what it's about, let's talk about what War and Peace is. Is it a novel? Is it a historical account? Is it a philosophy book? Now, it has all of those. It's none of those in particular, but all of those at the same time. You cannot say it's simply a novel. You cannot even say it's a historical novel. And you can't say it's a philosophical novel. That would be kind of close, but no, I wouldn't say that. Because there is such a mesh of real life figures and fictional characters in this book that it's just such a odd like mesh of an experience, but it's in many cases quite good. It works quite often. Tolstoy's a great writer. He writes social situations excellently. The way he writes about characters interacting with each other, excellent. And what they think about each other, he's very good. And he can be quite profound too when dealing with moments of death. He can be quite profound. I found, at least. But what were we talking about? So yeah, it is none of the above, but all of them in a way. But it is not all of them in the sense that it cannot be considered as just one of those entities. You cannot say, oh yes, it is just a historical novel. No, you cannot say that. You cannot say, oh yes, it is just a philosophical treatise. No, you can't just say that. And this relates quite well to the question of Russia, which is a question that looms over Russian literature throughout the 19th century and looms over Russian society even today. Now the question, what is Russia? I am not Russian. I know quite a lot of Russians. I'm quite familiar with Russian literature. And the question of what is Russia is a very pertinent one. It's a very pressing one in the 19th century. In the sense of, is Russia Europe? Is Russia part of this European project? Or is Russia Asia? Or is Russia something completely on its own? And like all Slavophiles, people who want to exalt this new nationalism, they're special. They are not defined by being European. They're not defined by being Asian. They are their own thing. Every country is going to take that stance, right? That we are so special. We're not like those neighbors. We're not like that. And that's not to say countries like Spain, France, Italy are not special, but they are distinctly European countries. There is, to this day, this is very apparent. They all use the euro. But even in the 19th century, that was becoming a question. There were these large coalitions. I don't want to get too into it, but Napoleon very much influenced most of Europe, but he didn't manage to impact Russia. His invasion was a complete failure of Russia, but it led to the loss of enormous life on both sides. But as Napoleon went eastward, he essentially incredibly influenced the constitutions, the way governments were run in these countries. Now, that is War and Peace as it relates to Russia. And that is why War and Peace, to my mind, can be regarded as the Russian epic. Now, it is not the Russian epic in the sense of it is the best Russian book, or it is by the best Russian author. Tolstoy is great, but most of them would say Pushkin. Pushkin is their Shakespeare. Now, the reason it is the Russian epic, at least to me, and I'm not Russian, is because of this deep entwined question of what is Russia, and that is posed in this book. And it is emblematic of that this book itself is not easily codified. Just like Tolstoy would like to believe that Russia itself is perhaps not easily codified to the outside, not easily understood. Now, language in the book, let's go back to French language. So, français. French is used in the book by the elites, and it is a marker of this question of Russian identity. The elites use French, and it shows how European values, European customs have sort of permeated into the aristocracy. But the French that is used in War and Peace, if you read the versions that have the French in them, and you know what they mean, they're very flippant and frivolous uses of French. It's not very important text, in my opinion, that's being used in French. Actually, let me backtrack. It's not that it's not important text, but typically when a character is speaking in French, they're engaging in gossip, is something that I've remarked. They're engaging with gossip or like trivialities, or there's always a sense of obscurement in the use of French. Now, when you go to the French army officers, that's not as much the case. They're really using French. When you go to the French letters, it's not as much the case. But just the impression I get is in high society, where many of the people are using French, it's used in a very sneaky, kind of shady fashion. Now, another thing about War and Peace. Now, Tolstoy is great with characters. He's great with characters. I love Pierre. I love Natasha. Even Dolgakov, who, there are some times where I absolutely hate that guy, but Dolgakov, Denisov, he's pretty cool too. And the old aristocrats are all quite cool too. Now, basically, I said this is about the Napoleonic Wars. I didn't lie, okay? I didn't lie. This was just a bit of a ramble. It's about the Napoleonic Wars, but it's about these families, these aristocratic families for the most part, and how their lives change throughout the Napoleonic Wars. And the novel takes place between 1805 and 1820, I believe. That's the time period, I believe. I didn't look at my notes or anything. I don't have any notes here. I'm just kind of freeballing, but I believe that's the time, 1805 to 1820. 1812 is where the big doomed Russian invasion the big doomed French invasion of Russia starts. And, what a catastrophe by Napoleon. There was a chart that I saw that showed Napoleon's numbers when he entered into Russia, and he had about 500,000 men when he entered into Russia. He left Russia with about 4,000 men. 4,000, 5,000 men, around that much. Wow, what a shocking loss of life. What a suicidal mission. And Tolstoy really takes a shot at Napoleon. Tolstoy doesn't buy this great man myth, this myth that Napoleon was, he was the guy who captured the values, and he was the guy who, by his own genius, he conquered most of Europe, and Tolstoy doesn't buy that. For Tolstoy, Napoleon n'est pas bon, apart from some reforms. That's a French joke. It's a French pun. I'm surprised people haven't used this stupid pun. It's a silly pun, but because it's French, I can see why, because they revere their Napoleon. They revere Le Grand. But yeah, il n'est pas bon, apart from some reforms. Okay, but Napoleon, Tolstoy kicks him off his perch. He doesn't buy this great man theory, and to him Napoleon is much more like a sociopathic warmonger who is so high on his own farts, believes in his myth so much, but he loses sight of the casualties and the destruction that he does, and the actual I want to say the needs of his people, but I think that is not correct as far as Tolstoy. Because Tolstoy's view on history and life which he goes through a lot of digressions, philosophical digressions. A lot of chapters are just philosophy, just him recounting history and recounting his theories, and sometimes it can be very, very dry. Tolstoy's philosophy is pretty much a fatalist philosophy that the gods, small g, kind of, or like a sort of hidden language, a hidden law or logic that we can't really detect, is governing human events in some way. And he goes through this very convoluted digression in the last epilogue about will and consciousness, and we seem to be ebbing in and out of free will, and free will is itself a paradox. And I don't want to go too much into it. I wasn't a big fan. I'm not a big fan of his philosophical let's just say his philosophical campaigns, which he goes on to. He's a good writer as it comes to novels. Now, the novelistic portion is quite nice in many cases in War and Peace. But this book would not be published nowadays. It is just too difficult to handle, too gangly. Now, it's very hard for me to talk about the book in the sense of whether I would recommend it or not, because it's not the type of book that I would for sure recommend to everyone. A lot of people love the book. A lot of people find the book a bit of a meme because of how long it is, how sort of cumbersome it is. It switches tone very often. Tolstoy can be very funny writer sometimes, and sometimes he can be so serious and dry, and it happens just like that sometimes. Yeah, I read it if it interests you. If you want to learn about, I would say this is the Russian epic, though. I would say that in line maybe with the Iliad as far as Greek, but I'm not sure how relevant. I'm sure the Iliad is relevant nowadays to the Greek people, but is it relevant to the modern Greece? Yeah, perhaps. I'm not sure. There's another book by an Iranian poet, Persian poet, Ferdowsi, and he wrote this we can barely call it a book. He wrote this gigantic epic. I forget its name, but it is essentially, from what I understand from all the Persian people I know, it is the Persian epic. It is the Persian book. The book that sort of exemplifies Persia's historical, that sort of cements Persia's historical and literary legacy. It recounts the events of Persia up until the Islamic rule. I don't want to digress too much on Ferdowsi, though. Now, yes, because of that, I would recommend War and Peace. That being said, it is cumbersome sometimes. And there are some times where, especially in the epilogue, I was like, oh my gosh, this is way too long. And I must confess that I did breeze through some of the pages much faster than I normally would have. Is there anything else to talk about regarding War and Peace? War and the Peace. Guerre et paix. I feel like I have missed something. Oh, okay. The point of the War and Peace being the national epic, this is what I would like to stress. The main thesis of this video. This is partly the reason why I'm making this video, is to have a conversation regarding this. And that is the thesis that I've been stressing, that War and Peace is the national epic because it exemplifies the question of what is Russia. And this is what Tolstoy engages with in War and Peace. This question has been peppered and threaded and touched on especially in 19th century Russian literature. Even Pushkin was starting with questioning these things. But this is not only expressed in the language, as I mentioned, not only expressed in, you can see it in the sort of undefinable, ill-defined genre that War and Peace is, but you can also see it in one of the characters, the main character, Pierre. Now, without going into too many details, spoilers, but Pierre is a bastard. He's the illegitimate son of a rich Russian aristocrat, and Pierre is educated in France. And at the start of War and Peace, Pierre has all these lofty ideals. I wanted to say Enlightenment ideals. I can say Enlightenment ideals. These ideals that were permeating throughout Europe in the early 19th century. And Napoleon is emblematic of a figure who held these ideals. And Pierre is actually quite, he's a Bonapartiste, it seems. He's espousing positive opinions of Napoleon, Pierre. But throughout the novel, we go to recognize Pierre. This is getting into spoiler territory, so if you don't want it, this is not going to be crazy spoilers, but if you don't like this, spoilers, get out. Get out. Leave. Au revoir. Okay, but throughout the novel, we see that Pierre is really someone who is searching for meaning, much more than the other characters. All of them are searching for meaning in some way, but Pierre is really, he is unsure about his life. Because Pierre ends up becoming very rich through the death of his father, and his father basically bequeaths him with pretty much almost everything that his father owned, Count Bezukov, and it's an incredibly lucrative estate, and he goes from being this sort of bum to not exactly a bum, but a sort of illegitimate child, to being one of the most sought after bachelors in Russian society. And he ends up living a sort of excessive life, but he realizes that that is not that's not what he likes. That's not what he's going for. And then he ends up pursuing a more mystical life, and he recognizes that is also something that he can't really engage with as much. But throughout the novel, he ends up becoming much more in line, or much more. He seems to have a stronger footing with Russian society and what it means to be Russian. And he learns this eventually through a Russian peasant, Platov, incredibly simple, not materialistic, not haughty or abstract thinking, a very simple Russian peasant. And I think that's itself also emblematic of this, what is Russia? In a way, Russia is a sort of simplicity from the inside, I guess, that Tolstoy espouses. Let me know what you thought, if these ramblings made any sense, if they were of any use, if they sparked any thoughts, if there are some odd things that didn't make any sense, or you don't like, or you take opposition to, for sure let me know. If I don't know what I'm talking about, if you think I read the wrong book. By the way, the Pivar and Volkonsky translation, I must say, it's an okay translation. Before I sign off, it's an okay translation. It's a very modernized translation. In some ways, I like the mod a bit better, because the mod engaged with, it seemed much more Victorian. There were Briticisms in it, but it was much more Victorian. And because Tolstoy wrote this was published in 1869? I want to have that Victorian feel. I want to feel like the book is a bit older. The Pivar and Volkanovsky translation is a very modern translation, I feel. It sometimes felt, dare I say it, a little bit sterile, a little bit cleaned. I know it's so horrible to read such a big book when you don't completely enjoy the translation. So my advice, if you are planning to read it, is to read a few parts of the translation. I did end up finishing it in the Pivar and Volkanovsky translation. Whether I will ever read this book again, I probably will read some parts of the book again. Definitely will read passages in parts. But I don't think that the translation completely soured it for me. But I just must preface, whenever you're reading books that are going to be in translation, especially if it's a language that is quite distant from English, like Russian, you really want to make sure you enjoy the translation. German to English, French to English, these translations, although there are a lot of bad translations in these languages to English, German and French are quite close to English, and you can get a lot of the idiosyncrasies. You can get the idiosyncratic stuff, whatever. Idiosyncrasies. Yeah, idiosyncrasies of these languages much better than Russian. Yes. But that is it. Signing off. For sure. Take care.